Institute. There's been a great deal of speculation and hopes expressed in recent weeks that we may be near the end of the 8+ years of civil conflict in Yemen that has devastated the country, killing tens of thousands and injuring many, many more, and causing one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world today. But we know that even an end to the conflict will only be the beginning of years of recovery and reconstruction for the country. On April 4th, MEI hosted a half-day conference that delved into important aspects of the social, economic, and political challenges that will confront Yemen in a post-conflict environment. If you are not able to join us for that program, a recording is available on the MEI website. But today we have a chance to look at another aspect of Yemen's challenge, but also one of opportunity to build back better. With our partners at the Rethinking Yemen Economy Initiative, we will discuss the potential for Yemen's transition away from its dependence on fossil fuels and towards renewable clean energy. To moderate today's discussion, I'm delighted to welcome my friend and colleague, Mohammed Mahmoud, Senior Fellow and Director of MEI's Climate and Water Program. But before we move to Mohammed, I would like to welcome and introduce Marie-Christiane Heinze, the President of the Center for Applied Research in Partnership with the Orient, one of the 3 implementing partners of the Rethinking Yemen Economy Initiative. Marie-Christine, welcome, and please.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. And first of all, please allow me to thank you, to thank our colleague Nadwa Dawsari, as well as other colleagues at the Middle East Institute for partnering up with us for this presentation on one of our most recent outputs from the Rethinking Yemen's Economy Initiative, the policy we will be presenting today and discussing with colleagues from your end. It's a real pleasure, and I would also like to thank everyone who's joining us for this conversation today. Allow me to say a few words about the Rethinking Yemen's Economy Initiative for those who are not familiar with it. This is a project that is co-implemented by 3 partners, by Deep Root Consulting, the Sana Center for Strategic Studies, and CARPO, of which I'm the president. It has been ongoing since 2017 and is co-funded by the European Union and the Kingdom of the Netherlands, the Embassy of the Kingdom of the Netherlands to Yemen. We see ourselves as a Track 2 initiative with a very specific focus, bringing together high-ranking Yemeni experts on the economy and development to build consensus on these really extremely crucial policy areas. These high-ranking experts are what we call the development champions. Some of them are in the call today, and they are represented by Hatem Bamehris, the Secretary General of the Development Champions Forum. And the topic we are discussing today was initially discussed by these experts, by the development champions at our last Development Champions Forum in Amman. That took place end of October, beginning of November last year. And so the publication we are presenting today, the findings and the discussions build on these discussions by the experts and have then been further elaborated through research of Akram Al-Muhammadi and Rafat Al-Akhali, who are presenting sort of some of the results of their research, but also of the discussions undertaken by the development champions. So very much looking forward to this, very much looking forward to the discussion. Thank you again, and handing over to Mohammed.
Excellent. Thank you so much for these opening remarks to set the stage for our conversation today. Before we move into the rest of the program proper, I'd like to briefly introduce our speakers on today's topic. First, I'd like to introduce Jessica Obaid. She's an energy policy consultant with 15 years of experience in engineering, think tanks, and consulting, focused on the development of sustainable energy systems. She's a partner at New Energy Consult and a senior global advisor for Azure Strategy Consultancy in London. And Jessica was also previously the chief energy engineer at the United Nations Development Program in Beirut, Lebanon. Next, I'd like to introduce Akram and Mohammadi. Akram is an energy researcher working as a sustainable energy expert at the Regional Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency in Egypt. He's participated in the implementation of several projects related to renewable energy, the power sector, and energy efficiency in the Arab region, including Yemen, which will be our regional focus for today. And then finally, we have Rafat Ali Al-Akhli. He's a development practitioner dedicated to addressing challenges in fragile and conflict-affected areas. He's the convener of the Council on State Fragility at the Blatvanik School of Government at the University of Oxford. And Rafat previously served as a minister in the government of Yemen, and even prior to that, led the government's policy reforms team. All of you have much more longer and accomplished bios, but for the interest of time, just highlighting some of your more salient backgrounds related to our topic today. So welcome to all of you. And before we get into the panel discussion for today's event, we'll actually start with a presentation from Akram and Rafat on a policy brief by the Rethinking Yemen's Economy Initiative on the scaling up of solar energy investments in Yemen. So transitioning to that, Akram and Rafat, I hand it off to you.
Thank you so much, Mohammed, and thanks for colleagues at the Middle East Institute for giving us this opportunity to present the findings of the paper, but more importantly, to discuss how to scale up solar energy investments in Yemen with all the attendees today. So I'm just going to start off with just a quick reminder of why the power sector is so important everywhere, but in Yemen especially. I mean, as we all know, it is critical for productivity and growth and for generating the jobs that we need, but also critical for environmental impact and for thinking through how can we transition from biomass and fossil fuels to renewable energy. More importantly, perhaps, especially in the context of Yemen, is that it has a lot of impact on gender empowerment. Both from the point of view of women spending less time collecting firewood and doing a lot of activities or enabling a lot of activities that can be run from homes if they have the electricity for it. And in the conflict and post-conflict period, it can also provide an important peace dividend as people find new jobs and provide livelihoods through having power and electricity. And finally, it's also important in increasing trust in government and legitimacy of any government, because improvement in the power sector, we always like to say, is literally visible. When and the opposite as well. When the power sector is not working effectively, citizens immediately see it. So that's just a quick reminder, and we will talk a little bit about why there was always a challenge in Yemen with the power sector and what the situation was even before the conflict, before we go into what is happening now and the applications of solar power. So I'll hand it over to my colleague Akram, who will talk us through what the situation was before the conflict. Akram, over to you.
Thank you, Rafa. I will start presenting some facts and indicators about the difficult situation of the electricity sector in Yemen before and during the war. For example, around half of population in Yemen had access to the public electricity. Only 23 of the rural population had access to the public electricity, although they represent around 75% of the population in Yemen. And also the actual capacity was only 1,000 megawatt, and almost 40% generated by Marib gas power station, which is the largest power plant in Yemen. In terms of the average electricity consumption in Yemen, the average electricity per capita before the war, it didn't exceed 255 while the average electricity consumption per capita is around 3,000 in the region or even worldwide. Sorry, Rafat, just I want to show this, the table. Yes, this table also shows the population and the installed capacity in the Arab countries, and shows that Yemen only have 1.5 giga for a population of 25 million. That was in 2013. Thank you. Next, please. This figure showed the electricity losses, which is one of the issues that drains the electricity sector resources in Yemen. And even until now, it shows that in 2013, more than 40% of the electricity is just wasted in the grid, 39 on the distribution sector only. Next, please. This slide or this figure shows the average electricity cost. The figure in the left shows that it's compared the electricity tariff with the electricity costs. It shows that around for the block of the residential sector from 201 to 350, the cost recovery rate is around 18% only. For the small commercial shops, only 50%, and for the hotels, agriculture, and public buildings, only 60%. And for the large industries, only 20%, which means that the electricity was heavily subsidized by the government. And in the internationally recognized government areas, it's still the residential tariff is still heavily subsidized, and the same of the tariff before the war. Next, please. This figure showed the results of the World Bank assessment on the dynamic needs assessment. It focused on 16 cities and focused on the key infrastructure. It shows the status of the physical status of the power sector infrastructure. It shows that 71 of the power plant is partially damaged, and 45 of the distributed generation units also partially damaged, while 10% completely damaged. And for the distribution substation, 30% was damaged, and shows also in the transmission substation and administration office. Next, please. This slide also shows the damage cost in the electricity sector, and the overall estimation was that the damage cost around $400 to $500 million. Next, please. This table shows the main or the key power plant that was connected to the national grid or the main national grid. The total of these capacities in 2013 was around 962, but in 2020 the capacity was declined to around 300 megawatt, which means that, for example, Marib, which was the main source of the electricity in Yemen, is not utilized, not fully utilized now. And also, like Mocha power station is not operational, and other power plant is not functioning. Now let's move to discuss the opportunities, and Rafat will handle this. Thank you.
Thanks, Akram. So in the middle of all these challenges, the question is, where would the opportunity lie? And we'd like to argue that the opportunity is actually in the solar energy, renewables overall, but specifically on solar, for the following reasons. First of all, Yemen is a Sun-Belt country, as the countries around the equator are known as. And the solar energy potential is huge in Yemen. And this has been already proved by a number of studies, including by the World Bank and others. And if we are able to capitalize and build on this solar energy, we can alleviate energy poverty, and especially in rural areas. So first of all, we have the abundance of the source, but also the past decade have seen significant improvements in solar PV technology, which means that the overall cost, what's called the levelized cost of energy from newly commissioned utility scale production has dropped from around 41 cents to only 4.8 cents now per kilowatt hour. So that's a significant drop in the technology itself. And why that's important specifically in Yemen is because of the difference. So we took a look at what the global weighted average first is, which, as I mentioned, was 4.8 cents. But we also looked at what is feasible in countries that are similar to Yemen. And in Afghanistan in 2016, there was a large utility scale power station that was built there using a lot of innovative financing support as well. But the overall levelized cost of energy out of that was 7.3 cents. So you can do something in a country like Afghanistan and with a total cost of 7.3 cents that comes out as an average. In Zambia, there was in 2016 as well, 6 cents. In Senegal, 4.7 cents. Of course, in the region, we're talking about, some of the most advanced arrangements and the cheapest costs in Saudi in 2021, 1.04 cent, and in UAE, 1.35. Now, if we compare where the opportunity is, we compare that to what is the current cost in Yemen for producing electricity, and it exceeds 25 cents per kilowatt hour in Yemen. Of course, this is all fossil fuel. As we will mention briefly, there is zero utility scale solar energy produced in Yemen. So it's all fossil fuel for now. And you have the gap between the 25 cents that is now costing to produce that electricity and between what could be possible if we go into solar. So Akram is going to walk us through kind of the current status of solar energy applications in Yemen across the three different subsectors, we could call them, the small and the mini grid and the utility scale. So over to you, Akram.
Thank you, Rafat. Yes, in terms of the small and medium standalone system, actually more than half of the population are using now small solar system to satisfy their urgent needs. For example, they are mainly using them for lighting and charging mobiles. And also there are several non-government organizations have installed solar energy system to public facilities like schools, health care, and water facilities. Also, following the frequent fuel crisis, many farmers started using solar-powered water pumps for irrigation purposes. And yes, it is estimated that the installed capacity of solar PV in Yemen reached 500 megawatts since or until 2017. And this figure shows the current practices for the small and medium standalone system. Next, please. For the solar micro and the mini grids, there are a few but promising cases of deploying solar-powered mini grids, which means from 10 kilowatt to 10 megawatt, and also for the microgrids. And many of these have been funded by the donors, like the EU, and implemented, for example, by the UNDP. And for the pilot, there are some pilots in Hagga and Lahig and Taiz. And also there is a project funded by the UAE in the Socotra. Next, please. For the utility scale, actually, Yemen failed to implement any utility scale project so far. And but recently there is and the authorities announced that there is a project with the capacity of 120 megawatt in Aden, and another project also with the capacity of 20 megawatt will be installed in Al-Muqa. Thank you. Over to Rafa to discuss about the challenges and the recommendation of the electricity solar energy in Yemen. Over to you, Rafa.
Thanks, Akram. So Quickly, we won't be going through all the challenges that were accounted for in the paper itself, but just to highlight that each of these, what we could call them subsectors or different applications of solar energy, are facing different challenges in Yemen. So if we look at the small and medium scale, the standalone systems that Takram explained, the biggest challenge has been the high upfront costs of these systems. So it's an access to finance issue, and therefore, ways to address it comes from that angle, which we'll talk about later. But that's then the top issue. And the second top issue is the quality standards. So a lot of the market in Yemen is dominated by cheap and poor quality products because of the inability of the majority of consumers to pay the higher prices for higher quality products. And because of that, the graph that Akram showed and the estimates that up to 2017, 500 megawatts of solar energy was installed. A lot of more recent estimate, there's a huge drop in that, because what happened is a lot of these systems eventually failed very quickly, and consumers started losing trust and confidence in these solutions and opting to go back to much more expensive private provided or private provision of electricity in the failure of the public sector, because they couldn't rely on these products. So these are the two things to keep in mind for the first application on the standalone systems. When it comes to the mini grids, the biggest challenge is that there isn't really a push or a focus on it from government policies and from the authorities in general. The thinking is still around large generation projects in key urban centers, and so they seem to be not considered. And there's also not enough thinking about innovative financing models to scale this up, both from the government and from the donor side. And primarily, the donors have relied on just grant funding to NGOs to implement these without necessarily thinking about how to utilize market mechanisms for that. And finally, when it comes to the more larger applications, utility scale solar, there the biggest is, of course, the high political and economic risk, because these projects are much larger, tens of millions of dollars. And in the current situation, they are faced with these high risks. And therefore, the big issue becomes around guarantees and financing and how to put together packages that investors would be interested in, or possibly how to find donors that are willing to invest in these, such as the example that Akram mentioned, the UAE investing in 120 megawatt in Aden. So this is a quick preview of the challenges. But really, to address these challenges, we need a paradigm shift. And we're arguing for 3 paradigm shifts, not just one. The first is to move away from this exclusive focus on large and fossil fuel-based centralized power generation to a stronger prioritization of smaller and distributed renewable energy generation. And this is primarily from a government perspective. A lot of the planners are still in the mode of, whenever they think about how to address the crisis, is how can we build these large stations? And this has been proven by many studies that especially in fragile and conflict affected states, the high risk makes such centralized power stations not the most efficient when you count the risk in. And so we need this shift to start thinking more about distributed renewable. And it doesn't mean that we drop completely the large fossil fuel base, but we need to make that transition quickly. But we also need to make the transition not only in terms of the way we structure the power grid, but also the way we plan and implement the whole and think about the sector, because currently it's still very centralized. And we need to move into an empowerment of local authorities and local public electricity corporation branches, so that they can lead in each of the governorates the best way forward in the power sector. And the third paradigm shift is moving from the current, what seems like an overemphasis on supporting small standalone solar systems delivered by mostly international NGOs and development agencies, to thinking about how can we prioritize innovative financing models and market creating interventions so that it can be a more sustainable sector and it can be scaled up. So these are the kind of three major shifts that are required. The paper goes into recommendations again for each of these. I won't go through them, but you can see on the screen that each one requires slightly different interventions depending on the challenges, the specific challenges facing each of the applications within Yemen. So I'll stop here, and this was our brief presentation on the contents, and I hope that you'll get a chance to actually read the full policy brief, and I'll go back to you, Mohammed.
Thank you so much, Akram and Rafat. And just as Rafat mentioned, if you go back to the original event page for this, we do have a link for the policy brief for you to be able to take more time and dive into the details, the meat of the topic that was just briefly discussed in terms of the policy brief. So now we'll move on to our panel discussion, but just a couple of items before we begin on that. For any of our audience that are joining us live through Zoom and who'd also like to submit questions, you can actually do so through the Q&A function in Zoom. And I will try to incorporate questions into the discussion as best as I can as we're moving through our discussion topics progressively. Also, another item, we're going to have a Zoom poll available for those of you that are joining us live through Zoom to be able to share your feedback at the end of the discussion. So once we're wrapping up our discussion, we'll bring up the poll and I'll remind you to please submit your responses to that. With that, with those housekeeping items out the way, let's dive into our discussion, our panel discussion. Let me maybe start with a question that sort of begins to synthesize some of the items and messages that was just shared to us through the presentation. And Jessica, I'll turn to you and as sort of the outsider in terms of the policy brief and you know, like the rest of our audience, kind of digesting this information. What is your first reactions from the presentation and the analysis? And in terms of that, what surprised you that you thought was new information to you? And in the other contrast, what was maybe in line with what you expected? And in both cases, just give us some reasoning, and I think for the benefit of the audience, why in either case, what you found was surprising, why was the case, and what you found to be as you expected, why was the case for that as well?
Let me start by saying that this is a much needed policy brief, especially planning ahead is quite needed in the solar energy industry in general, in any market, and especially when you're going into conflict, post-conflict, and when you have all these small-scale distributed renewable energy. What actually surprised me positively is actually the presence of the existence of data on the cost and percentage of damages to the infrastructure, which normally we struggle to find data across the entire region, especially in terms of the scale of the conflict impact on the infrastructure in the power sector. There are things that are, of course, at par with the rest of the region, especially in terms of decentralization. The governments in the region in general prefer more to have large-scale infrastructure, large-scale power plants, utilities, solar farms, etc., because there's so much interest in the energy sector in general and in maintaining state ownership and government involvement in the energy sector. So that goes against a lot of the decentralized concept, and this is why we don't have so much decentralization across the region, except when there's a policy failure or institutional failure in the power sector. And the challenges of the solar industry, of course, are very important to be mitigated. And I want to add 2 points on why this is very important as well. That because two additional reasons is that in terms of conflict countries, it's very hard in terms of logistics to get fossil fuels to so many areas. So it's very important to optimize the use of resources, the abundance of solar energy in our side of the world. and that it takes years and often decades post-conflict to actually rehabilitate the power sector infrastructure. So this is also very important to have immediate response in terms of energy and renewable energy.
Thank you, Jessica. And I know, obviously, Akram and Rafat, you were involved with the study, but even in, just to give you an opportunity in case you wanted to answer this question, as you were undergoing sort of this analysis and research, were there similar things that you found surprising and things that, you know, reaffirmed maybe some ideas that you had going into the project and the study?
Maybe I can start with a couple of reflections. One was actually, I think, the most heartwarming, I would say, out of this whole process was meeting some of the entrepreneurs that are working on the microgrids. Actually, we met with the lady who was in one of the slides. Iman Hadi is her name in Abs, and she was able to start a small microgrid operation in her village that is now covering the whole village, and she's now expanding to other villages. She did that together with 10 other women who formed like a small micro enterprise. And it was such an inspiration to just see the transformation that happened, not only economically, but even socially, and their ability to, you know, face a very conservative society in rural Yemen. That now accepts that women can be part of that industry. And so I think that to me was one of the best surprises, if it's a surprise. But also the other part, I think, is there's always talk that it's difficult to find interested investors to invest in this sector. But actually, a lot of the private sector, specifically the Yemeni private sector, we found very willing to invest in this sector and able to, and all they were asking for and all they need is the structure in place to just structure these financial transactions and get the right guarantees in place. But the willingness is there, the ability is there, the money is there. It just needs the structure to be put in place.
Okay.
Yes, actually, I agree with the Rafat. I just want to add that it's the positive thing that some of the donors are willing to establish now some of the utility scale projects, as mentioned in Mocha and Eden, which will open the solar investment in Yemen, especially in the utility scale. And also the positive thing that, as you know, or as you may know, that there are many diesel generators in Aden, in Sana'a and other areas. They are now supplying to the consumer directly. So they are now considering hybridizing this diesel generator with solar energy, which is a good thing to invest in. Thank you.
Great. Next question I had, just sort of a realization of where we're probably going forward from here, and that is that the expansion of solar energy technologies in Yemen are probably going to mean that the country is going to have more distributed and non-grid connected solar energy generation systems, particularly in the rural areas that may be far away from central type grids, electric grids. What are some of the consequences of that, essentially, of having most of the solar energy expansion in Yemen potentially occurring in this manner in these rural areas? But maybe we'll start with you, and others feel free to provide your perspective as well.
Yeah, I think one consideration is that it's a very positive thing, in my opinion, because that's where we lacked the most. There was a lot of focus before the war, primarily on urban. We had a rural electrification project that was making very slow progress, I would say. But trying to get the grid to the over 300,000 settlements that we have in Yemen, on the top of mountains and in different areas, it's a very difficult terrain and structure of communities as well, to try and hope for the grid to get everywhere. So getting these distributed renewable solar mini grids and solutions, I think is definitely a positive thing to have. At the same time, there is always a lot of concern that if you go that way, you lose a lot of the efficiencies of having a central grid, and both cost efficiencies and technology efficiencies. But I think there has been a lot of, again, advancement in the technology that even when you design these mini grids, you can design them in a way that they can connect to the main grid eventually when they come in. And so I think that's another consideration.
Akram or Jessica, do you have a perspective?
Yes. So I also want to add that it's very important, and we don't necessarily need to have a national grid everywhere, especially as has been discussed that now there are technological advancements and we can have mini grid, microgrids, and others. The risk, however, is that when all these efforts are completely decentralized and there is no institutional umbrella to these efforts, we often have lack of coordination, uncollaborated, unorganized distribution, which means duplication of efforts in some places. No account for growth, because you need to grow the economy at some point, and you need to account for this as well. For productive sectors, we see that in conflict and post-conflict areas, countries, we see that the focus is on humanitarian assistance for hospitals, for schools. This is very important, of course, but you also want to provide some sort of mechanism for productive sectors, for households and others. So having a kind of an integrated approach is so much needed. However, it's often challenged by the absence of strong institutions and coordination umbrellas.
I think you also wanted to add something, right?
Sorry. Yes, I just want to add that for the case of Yemen, since there is an investment risk and many private sector not, for example, are not interested to invest in the rural areas or other areas. So it is important to enable the communities to have their own solar system, for example, to manage this system. I think this approach will be a good solution to have solar or other systems. Thank you.
If I may just add, I think the point that Jessica made is one of the critical tensions we feel, because especially the private sector is looking to ensure that there is enough attention to the large needs of the factories and the economic production side, so that they can create jobs. And there's always this tension, if we advocate too much that the attention should be given to the smaller and more distributed and in the rural areas, then that might leave a gap in the base load that is required for the main industrial consumers that are in place in the cities. So it's always this tension in how to balance the balance the priorities of both the government and the donors across these different priorities.
I'm glad you said that, because that kind of dovetails into the next two topics I want to get your thoughts on. First, let's go back to the sort of higher, bigger level, right? And connect with that, the donors and sort of the international funding and agreements. And so one of those, to me, is the Masdar cooperation agreement that was mentioned in the policy brief. And it seems to be a promising step towards introducing Yemen's sort of first large-scale, utility-scale solar type project. Obviously, there is infrastructure and funding requirements to scale that up and to get it into operation and implementation. But besides that, besides the considerations for infrastructure construction and funding and starting that up, what else would need to be done, or what else is required to help make this pilot project successful as an example, or as a template, maybe even for more utility scale, the sort of the larger end utility scale solar projects in Yemen, that they could also proliferate at that larger level. And maybe Afat, you can again start us on that, since you ended on that previous point that led to this.
Yeah, I think that's something we looked at a lot, and I think, as you said, probably the easier part is the funding and the building of the infrastructure. However, if we are looking to scale it, first of all, I think it's very unlikely that we would have, we would continue to have grant-funded scaling up of these projects. So the UAE, in this example, have funded this 120 megawatts, and another 20 megawatts in Mocha is planned. But we cannot sustainably think that donors will put in a lot of money into building a whole sector. So the only sustainable way, and alternatively, of course, the government does not have the resources, and that is why nothing has happened so far until a donor came through. So the only sustainable way for this to scale up is through private sector. And if we look at this first pilot, I think it will generate very useful lessons on the more technology side and infrastructure side, as I mentioned. But unfortunately, I don't think it will generate a lot in terms of how to engage the private sector, because it's grant funded, and then it will be operated, or it's planned to be operated by the Public Electricity Corporation. Now, we will probably see a lot of challenges on that end, as we've seen in other places, because the public sector is, especially under the current conflict situation, is faced with tremendous capacity challenges and financial challenges, to pay salaries, to ensure any sustainability of this. And especially that if we don't address the other side, which Akram mentioned in his introduction, the tariff side, right? So if this public electricity sector continues to charge much less than what the cost of producing the electricity is, they will always have this gap, which the government will always struggle to subsidize, and therefore the operation of it will suffer. So I think if we really want to move towards more sustainable and actually feasible scaling up, we need to think about how to do this through private sector provisioning and operation, and in a way that addresses not only the production side, but also the demand side.
Anyone else want to follow up on that?
Yes.
Maybe I will just, sorry, Jessica, go ahead, please.
No, I'll go after you.
Go ahead, Akram.
Okay. What I want to just to add is that it is important to rehabilitate the infrastructure of the electricity sector, because such a utility scale project is supposed to be connected to the grid. So in order to benefit from the electricity that will be produced, so there is the need to rehabilitate the infrastructure, also to reduce the electricity losses, because it is not logical to get this electricity and just waste it in the electricity. And also there is a need for risk mitigation strategies, and also incentives like financial incentives and other things. Thank you. Go ahead, Jessica.
Akram mentioned some of my points on the grid, but yeah, a lot of this electricity could be curtailed unless the grid is fixed. And the other thing is the need to work in parallel on de-risking renewable energy projects, and that came up a lot in Rafat and Akram's presentation, the risk. And that starts with counterparty risk, which is the Public Electricity Corporation. You need to have a utility that's financially sound to be able to sign these projects in the future. With private investors, you need to have the licensing, and licensing is a huge issue and could take years to figure out in most countries. And often what we see in similar contexts is that the electricity utility and eventually the people end up paying a high risk premium unless there has been de-risking, ensuring political stability, that's a big thing, but also some sort of bankable project, financial mechanisms in place, regulations, licenses, all these figured out. Otherwise, it's going to be a high cost, even compared to prices in the region and prices of similar contexts. So that needs to be sorted out, especially that these contracts are signed for long-term, some 25 years, standard power purchasing agreements for solar. So you don't want to carry a high cost of electricity for long periods of time. And this is why de-risking is very important.
Great. I know we're getting a few questions from our audience. I'm going to get to them a little bit later because a good amount of them feed into a question that I'm going to ask later in our discussion. So just be patient, listeners. Jessica, maybe I'll start with you on this next question. So we started with this potential idea of proliferation in the rural sector, and it raised the point that most of those will likely be the smaller scale application of solar systems. And then we just talked about the larger scale. But I want to go back to the smaller scale and ask a very specific question, which is, with this potential of proliferation of solar microgrids and standalone solar systems in Yemen, it seems to be inevitable if we move into expansion of solar applications in the country. How can these smaller scale solar systems be improved in terms of things like reliability, maintenance, support, and even environmental or waste management? Just in consideration that, you know, because they're sort of on the smaller scale, there's there's a lack of maybe an oversight or regulation, right? It's sort of every microgrid or every standalone for themselves. So if people are going to move in that direction, what are some even tips or guidelines that can make them successful in application and minimize any negative, right? Any negative implications of moving into more of those types of systems, solar systems?
I think first involve the people, the local community always, because they know what their needs are. We find in many places that great systems are implemented in places where they just don't meet the needs of the local community. And so involving the people early on and the local community in terms of needs assessment, but also ensuring technology transfer and knowledge transfer, because these systems require maintenance, someone to make sure that the operation is optimized. And when they're donor-led and developed through 8 agencies and development agencies, sometimes there's a lack of follow-up and lack of maintenance and lack of passing this, transferring this knowledge and this technology to the local community that's supposed to maintain it and operate it for a long period of time. So involving the people is very important at very early stages. And having this knowledge transferred and technology transfer also enables the second very important thing in society, and that's entrepreneurship and innovation. And the youth are going to find a lot of opportunities in doing that and upscaling the market and upscaling renewable energy. And that's also critical because there could be a lot of low quality product and low quality installations when you don't have consumer protection or a strong regulator in place. So ensuring that knowledge transfer, capacity building also minds this gap. The other thing is that I don't think there's a substitution for a strong governance and having an umbrella institution. It could be at a local level, community level. It could be through municipalities. It could be through the community coming together as a sort of cooperative, solar cooperative, owning shares in the solar systems. That involves the people, creates a sense of ownership for the systems, but also ensures that these systems will be taken care of and optimized for a long period of time.
Akam, can you add to that if you'd like?
Sorry, yes. Yes, I agree with Jessica on what she mentioned. What I want to add is that it is important, like Rafat mentioned, that to adopt standards for the solar energy products in Yemen and to, for example, ban the poor quality products to enter the market, and also to establish like a certification program for the installers and designers of the people in Yemen, because during the war, many youth just found it an opportunity to work in this sector without any qualification or any certification to install such systems. So what I think is that two things is important for the electricity sector in Yemen. Thank you.
Fuad, did they leave anything for you?
Oh, they covered it.
They covered it. You're good?
Yeah, I'm good.
Okay, good. So my next question, actually, I'm going to ask it, and I'm going to pull in a few of the audience questions, which are relevant to it. So let me ask the question, and I'll just highlight a couple of the audience questions that I think are connected or could be part of the response. So much of the finance, we've talked about donors and international support and sort of begin to galvanize the expansion of these solar projects. So much of it to date, at least per your presentation and the policy brief, much of the financial support for these solar generation products has come from international donors and funding. So with that in mind, and with that in hand, potentially continuing on, how can these types of funding mechanisms be leveraged to address some of the current gaps in Yemen's solar energy utilization, such as expanded utility scale solar generation, policies and regulations for the solar industry in Yemen to sort of standardize it, maybe is a way. So the question is, it's an implicit question in there. The question is, how do you use the funding mechanisms to address some of these gaps, but you're also telling us what those gaps are. But before I pass it off to you guys to answer that, let me pull in a couple of questions from the audience that I think fit this theme. One came in, and I think you've kind of talked about this in an earlier point, Fuad, which is taxes imposed on solar panel imports. The view is that it's hindering growth. Are there any plans that all of you are aware of, which may help remove or reduce those import taxes? So maybe that funding, international funding, can leverage that. And then the other question is, how can consulting or strategic advisory companies, so maybe in tangent with donors, help with gathering insight, information on the challenges and needs to help successfully distribute generation environment in Yemen, maybe in areas of improving decision making by providing more data to stakeholders, etc. So the main question, I threw in a couple of the audience questions I think fit in, and maybe Akram will start with you this time if you want to address that. I threw a lot at you, so let me know if you want me to highlight one area versus the other in the question.
Yes, you will start with the taxes. Yes, unfortunately, there is a double taxation on the solar energy products. So for the main outlets or in the borders of the main outlets in Yemen, there is actually, I didn't hear that there is a plan to remove this taxation. But for example, in the northern and central area, there are some conditions to get this exemption from the taxes. But for the financial mechanism, actually now the donors only focusing on the installing just a small system for the public facilities, and only there is a World Bank project that they are financing just like ecosystem for the poor people. This is only the things that in terms of the financing. Maybe I will leave the other questions to Rafer to respond to them. Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead, Dr.
Thanks, Akram. So a few things. So first of all, on how to better maybe use of international funds or aid funds, I'd say 3 points, one for each of the applications that we talked about or the subsectors. So for the standalone systems, as we mentioned, the biggest challenge is actually the cost and people not being able to afford it, including like farmers and others. And so there, I think if some of the international aid money can be used to set up, and this idea has been worked on a lot, but hasn't materialized fully, to set up a fund of sorts to subsidize in a way, at least the interest. So people can take a loan instead of, because right now a lot of the funding goes to grant funding to provide directly these, and that's always in one way or another, distorts the markets, as we say. So if we are able to set up a fund that could at least allow people to take loans and with very minimal interest rates, that would be, I think, a better use of international aid funding. And it can be built into it, some conditions that would address the quality standards issues and all that. So, people who use this, have access to these loans need to buy, pre-approved or, certified products. So that's one for that sector. For the second sector, which is the microgrids and mini grids, I think it would be excellent if it is thought of by the donors as a way to crowd in the private sector. So right now, what we've documented as well in the policy brief, a lot of the focus is how to do these pilots so we can get more donor aid to do more international NGO implementation of more microgrids. But I think it should be a different approach where how can we do these pilots to produce the data needed, and make it public, feasibility studies and everything else, so that the model can be then picked up and taken by other private entrepreneurs and scaled up that way. But right now, there isn't any of that happening. It's all internal, it's all protected, and it's all, with the aim of getting more funding to implement by international development agencies. So that's on that sector. On the third sector, which is the utility scale, I think this is where, Jessica helpfully highlighted, the de-risking. So if we are to use a lot of the donor funds to allocate it towards de-risking products, whether it's, guarantees, and there are certain institutions that are specialized in this, like media out of the World Bank and others. But that's what we need. We need to use it to unlock the private investments, again, rather than using it to just build it yourself, because there's a limit to how much you can do if you don't mobilize private investment. So that's in terms of the financial support. If you allow me to say just a couple of things on the questions from the participants. The first one on taxes, as Akram mentioned, there's not only taxes, but double taxation. So you have to pay when you come in through the internationally recognized government ports, and then you have to pay taxes again if you bring the goods to the de facto authority areas. So that, I think, is still there. As Akram mentioned, there was what could have been, I guess, a positive thing where the de facto authorities waived import taxations on solar energy products. But it's a very complicated process to get that waiver, that a lot of the importers we talked to said they don't really benefit from it because of that. But it's something that can be built on, possibly. The other thing that importers have complained a lot about, but which there is a positive change now, is the import ban. So there has been an import ban since 2015 on a long list of items due to its possible use in the military uses. But 3 weeks ago, this was lifted. So in the middle of Ramadan, this was lifted by, or announced to be lifted by, the coalition forces. And so now, and especially the solar panels and solar batteries and all that was on that list, and it was causing a lot of additional hurdles for it. So that was lifted. So maybe that makes the life of importers a little bit easier, but the taxation remains. In terms of the data, I think that's absolutely an area that is needed. I think, as was mentioned by the person who asked, we need more of it. How can it be done? Reach out to us after, and we can talk a lot about how it can be done. We've been doing a lot at Deep-Root with that, both for IFC and for others, but we can definitely share a few ideas of how to do that.
Jessica, before I give you a chance to respond to the same question, let me throw another another question up top. This actually came from the audience members, one of the audience members, and I think it ties into this idea of where funding can be helpful, right? Which is the premise of the question. And they threw in this idea of thinking about infrastructure, right? So if the large scale utility grid does expand, now we have to think about infrastructure expansions, things like transmission lines, connective grids, that type of thing. So answer your question as intended, but if you can comment on that as well, that would be great.
They do not go against each other, having a sustainable, large-scale infrastructure, centralized. They're supposed to come. The two solutions are supposed to complement each other in an ideal world, because that means you need to have a proper vision for the sector, but also an action plan, a very strategic action plan on how to get there that involves long-term solutions, because everything in terms of grid rehabilitation and expansion, power plants building is going to take several years, but also immediate short-term plan that ensures reliable electricity. So having two plans, these two plans are normally what we would hope for, but it's normally easier said than actually done. But there are so many different ways where having decentralized solution could also fall within a long-term strategy, where some of these plants, if they could operate not only as off-grid and it's just changing inverter and some of these components, it would be a hybrid, for example, hybrid inverter that works with batteries, but also grid connected. So you can later on connect to the grid, or have virtual power plants that could be operated by a public utility. But all these fall within having all this pre-planning, preparation, and having a solid plan, which normally doesn't happen in conflict and post-conflict. But that ties into your question on the donor, on the financial support that comes from aid. And I think it's very critical for aid agencies and development agencies and foreign donors to actually sit together and have at least a plan amongst each other. First, on evaluating their previous projects, because we tend to replicate systems without necessarily going through the evaluation on whether these systems first did meet their targets and their KPIs. And two, if they actually did meet the needs of the local community. And three, what kind of lessons we draw from this. So that's very important in order to establish future projects and provide some sort of blended finance and assistance, which comes in the form of financial support for a green investment facility, and technical advisory and technical assistance, at least for the first few projects, especially in terms of utility scale. And three, that comes with also capacity building and training. So there should be an entire mechanism in place for it not to end up being a chaotic market with a lot of replication of projects, which we see in so many countries.
Excellent. Thanks for that. Thanks for tying in that last question into your response. As we sort of begin to wind down, let me ask what I think could be our final question. We've talked about a lot of strategies, opportunities, ways to address some of the challenges that was presented in the front end through the policy brief and even through our discussion. But if I was to kind of push each of you to really, if you had a magic wand and you can do this immediately, right? So if, out of all the number of recommendations that we've talked about, or maybe haven't even talked about, that could be proposed, to help to successfully scale up the sort of solar energy investment implementation application in Yemen. And it could be a multiple number of things or a sequence of things, but for each of you, which recommendation, which sort of path, which action strategy do you consider to be the most important in terms of priority for application in Yemen to get towards that sort of ideal future of a very energy resilient or energy capable available capacity in Yemen. Maybe Jessica, I'll start with you since you're already on the mic, so to speak.
Yeah, so I think I always say that as a green renewable energy person, that renewable energy is not a magic solution if you do not have a proper foundation in place. So regardless of the technology or the deployment model of solar photovoltaic systems or others, you need to have a strong process in place and some sort of governance. I prefer to have a strong institution normally, but that's also too ideal. But this is why it's very important to have, at this stage, I think, not only having dispersed financing mechanisms and aid to actually to have some sort of an investment facility that could support projects with clear performance indicators and criteria for who and how they can tap into this financing, and providing capacity building to ensure that the local community is involved and does receive a technology and knowledge transfer, and they can maintain these systems and promote youth entrepreneurship and innovation to actually develop these further until you can attract further private sector investments and support.
Thank you. Akram, what's the highest on your list?
Yes, for me, I think for the utility scale project, I believe that adopting like guarantees for the private sector is a must to encourage the private sector to invest. And also for the microgrids and small scale systems, it is important to like establish funds or revolving funds to the microgrids and small systems. Thank you.
Fud, I guess you have the final word.
No, I think just to reiterate probably some of the points already. One is the recommendation to the government side, as Jessica mentioned, but in Yemen specifically, I mean, we don't feel that there is a prioritization of this, and this could be understood given, of course, the multiple other challenges. And even in the power sector, you know, the priority has been just to how do we get the fuel in to maintain the current generation and avoid popular unrest because of that. But there hasn't been enough focus on thinking through the strategic side and how can we actually, you know, transition to this, for example, which might resolve it, including how to put in place the necessary structures to support private sector investments in this. There was, and it's mentioned in the brief, there was, you know, one attempt to try and advertise a tender for private sector investments in a few, I think 7 or 9 stations generation, but it didn't work because the whole system is not in place, the structure is not in place. So I think that's one for the government, really to give it a focus, you know, step out of this day-to-day emergency firefighting mode that has extended for 8 years now, and really think about how do we take all this and transition to something more sustainable. The second one is more to the donor side, which Jessica helpfully answered in a previous question. This idea of how can we coordinate better. And in the paper, we talk about the need to establish like a renewable energy cluster, similar to the other humanitarian clusters that are in place. But we do already see what Jessica mentioned, you know, a lot of the replication in many cases of the projects, not necessarily addressing, you know, the different gaps. So I think there is a lot of benefit to really putting a platform together specifically for renewable energy. And the third, I think, would be more for the private sector. And I'm glad to see there are a few of the private sector investors here in this session. And I think there is a lot that can be done if the private sector also begins actively working on how to unlock these bottlenecks, how to help the government and how to help the donors as well in thinking through the best way to unlock the bottlenecks and allow private sector investments to come in.
Excellent. Thank you all for I think those are all great pathways to expand on the current trajectory, hopefully positively the current trajectory for energy and particularly solar energy utilization. So I think maybe we can share the poll now and give our audience a few moments to do that. So I'll just to buy our audience time to fill this out, I'll just walk through it on what the questions are. So several questions in the poll, about 5 of them. First question is just sort of reflective on the material and discussion that you heard. What percentage of this information was new to you? Much like we asked our panel in the beginning in terms of the study, what was surprising and what wasn't in terms of its novelty. The second question is whether you can use this session's information. And then the third question is if you would like to learn more about this topic. And the fourth question is more on commenting by rating the content of the slides, the presentation that you saw in the beginning. And then finally, more of a overarching question for the entire segment in terms of the event, both in this case for the webinar, just your evaluation of that. So I'm giving our audience some time to respond to that. I just want to say thank you very much to our panelists. I really appreciate your time and expertise, your perspective, and then also sharing, I think, really helpful, useful information and an area and topic that I think we don't hear enough about, and an area I think we need to hear more about in terms of improving conditions overall in different parts of the Middle East. Jerry, anyone's, I guess I'll give a final opportunity if folks want to have any final comments as I do the best I can to squeeze more time for our audience to complete the questionnaire.
Thanks, Mohammed, and perhaps Marie-Christiane would also like to say something, but I just want to thank Rifat and Akram and Jessica for a really interesting and informative conversation about an issue that is terribly significant in terms of Yemen's recovery and reconstruction, and certainly I think that the whole question of the energy sector and how Yemen can go forward and provide the energy that is required not only for economic development in Yemen in the future, but also for the development of the society, to give Yemenis, both in the rural areas and the cities, the resources that they need in order to build better lives for themselves, is critically important. And certainly, this is an opportunity to really look at renewables, not only solar, but also wind. Yemen has tremendous wind potential as well, to really leapfrog Yemen into a much more secure and stable economic future. So thank you for everybody's participation, and certainly for our friends at the Rethinking Yemen's Economy initiative. Thanks.
Yes, and if I may come in, allow me to also thank again the Middle East Institute for hosting us for this presentation. I would also very much like to thank the presenters, and particularly Jessica, who is obviously an outsider sort of to this project and the publication. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge. It's really always good to get sort of an outside perspective, assessment, additional knowledge. Mohammed, thank you for really knowledgeable moderation. It's always good to have a moderator who knows what he's talking about. The questions were excellent, also for everyone who came in with questions in the chat. that really help move the conversation forward. I would just like to point out that in RAI, obviously, we don't only focus on solar energy. As I said earlier on, we focus on quite a number of different issues related to the economy and to development in Yemen. So I'd really like to invite you to visit our website. We've produced more than 30 publications on crucial policy areas related to topics, to the financial system, to women's engagement in the economy, water issues, fisheries, you name it, it's there. So do visit our website and come back to us with questions and maybe ideas of further areas of engagement.